I am Father Cyril Frank Borg, a discharged Carmelite father from Malta. I came to Israel about 30 years ago as a parish priest, and I remained a parish priest up to about 2 years ago, when I felt that I'm growing old and we need a new energy in the parish church, so we nominated a new parish priest to replace me about 2 years ago.
When did the Latin Church Christians first come to Haifa?
It is very difficult to say when the Christians started residing in Haifa, but most certainly about over 300 years ago there was a small community in Haifa, because we know from the document, from a decree sanctioned by His Highness the Prince Emir Zeben Tarabei, when he decreed that the Carmelite fathers residing in Haifa could bury the faithful under their jurisdiction, and in the same decree he acknowledged as Carmelite property the burial ground, the residence, and the guest house attached to it.
What was their number?
Also, it is difficult to state what was the number of the Christians living in those days, but from letters and other documents left by Father Prospero, who came and settled in Haifa in the beginning of the 17th century, exactly in 1631, he says that he administered the Christian community, the few Catholics living in Haifa, and also some foreigners who were employed in import and trading agencies, as well as employees with the representatives of the Spanish and French consulates.
Where did they live?
Over 300 years ago, Haifa was a very small district on the seashore, in a site which later we called Haifa El Atika, Old Haifa, today's Bet Galim. Also, about 350 years ago, there started another new district at about 20 minutes walk to this Old Haifa. This was also on the seashore, and it started extending itself towards the hills, where today there is the government's house, and where in 1765 the governor Daher El Omar built the fortress of Haifa on a site of 250 meters in length and 150 meters in width, and the same governor also surrounded this new district of Haifa with walls and bastions, which remained partly till the time of the British Mandate in 1919-1920. This district is where today, there is as a national monument, the old railway station.
How was the Latin parish founded in Haifa?
In the canonical meaning of the word, the Latin parish church began to exist in the year 1832, because it was in that year when the acting parish priest started recording the baptisms administered and the wedding and the marriages performed in Haifa. Also, it was in those years when the Carmelite fathers began holding the statistics of the members of the Latin community. And also, because it was in 1932 when the Latin parish church in Haifa held 4 days of great celebrations to commemorate the first centenary of the existence of the Latin parish church in Haifa. In the first 3 days they held celebrations in the different Oriental rites, Melkite, Melkite rite, Maronite rite, and Latin rite, and on the fourth day, which was a Sunday, His Beatitude, Monsignor Luigi Vallazzina, held a solemn procession carrying the statue of Our Lady of Mount Carmel from the Latin Parish Church in Haifa up to the sanctuary of Mount Carmel, about 3 miles distant. This procession is held also in these years, or rather every year we still hold the solemn procession on the third Sunday after Easter.
Who was the parish priest?
The parish priest in those days was Father Julius Calleia, born in Valletta, Malta in the year 1770. He came to Haifa in 1803 by order of the Superior General of the Carmelite Fathers in Rome, Father Peter Alexander, with the injunction to restore the sanctuary on Mount Carmel, which 4 years previously was ransacked and burned by the soldiers of the Jazzar, governor of Akko. And when Father Julius reached Mount Carmel, he found the monastery full of skeletons of dead French soldiers scattered in the cloister, along the corridors, and in the garden. Father Julius could not live over there, so he took refuge in our residence downtown in Haifa. And it was in this residence that he lived for several years. The first letter, still preserved in the archives in Rome, bears the date of the year of June 1805, where Father Julius laments that he was tired of waiting for a companion, living like a Bedouin. And it was in this state of misery that the companion arrived 10 years later, on the 10th July 1816. And this companion was the known architect, Father Giovanni Battista Cassini. From well-known pilgrims who visited Father Julius, we know that it was from this small residence in Haifa that he administered the small Catholic community in Haifa. It was in this residence where he baptized the first child, and which gave origin to the Latin community, to the Latin parish church in Haifa. He was also the first parish priest in a long series of parish priests, and the other fathers who enlarged the residence and built bigger churches, but it was Father Julius who created this Latin parish church in Haifa on the foundation of his fervent prayers and unselfish dedication for the service of his parishioners.
Who was the first to build a small monastery in Haifa for the Latin?
It is difficult to say who built the first monastery, because the first monastery was built in the year 1767. But the presence of the Carmelite Fathers in Haifa goes back to the beginning of the 17th century, when Father Prospero, a venerable Spaniard, having previously obtained title deeds from His Highness the Emir Zeben Tarabei, he came to Haifa and took possession of Mount Carmel. We know from the early documents that Father Prospero bought a house and an adjoining guest house and a small land property in Haifa, and from there he administered the Catholics he found, and also visited the ships who anchored in the nearby seashore. This first residence of the Fathers took some importance when in 1660, in vigor of a contract stipulated by the French consul representing the Carmelite Fathers and His Highness the Emir Tarabay stipulated that all the Carmelite Fathers disembarking in the town, in the port of Haifa, pay no tribute or rates, and also acknowledged as Carmelite property the residence, the burial ground, the guest house. And also in the same contract it was stated that nobody could live in the guest house of the Carmelite Fathers without his explicit permission. But it was about 100 years later, in 1767, when the Italian architect, also a Carmelite father, Father Giambattista de Sant'Alessio, built the first proper residence for the Carmelite Fathers, also enlarged the guest house and a fenced courtyard with a cistern to collect the rainwater.
How was the Latin Church built?
In the year 1841, the well-known Italian architect and Carmelite father Fra Giovanni Battista Casini escogitated a plan to build an oval church with the residence of the fathers, the pharmacy, the guest house, and also some rooms and a big hall for the school. But as this property was very near the seashore, the fathers were afraid that they will not find solid foundations to hold this big building. So this plan was shelved and was never effected. 20 years later, the fathers prepared another plan to build a new church and accessories. We don't know exactly who prepared, the architect who prepared this plan, but it was practically the same, the one existing today, this over here, with the residence of the fathers on the right side of the church, a two-story building, and on the left side of the church, and at the back of the church with the pharmacy, the guest house, and enough rooms for the parish school. This was in the year 1865. But it took several years before the church was built. We know that His Beatitude, Monsignor Varerga, Latin Patriarch in Jerusalem, granted the permission to build this new parish church in April 1867. And 2 months later, in June 1867, the Superior General of the Carmelite Fathers in Rome, he gave the permission to the parish priest to build the church and allocated to him also the sum of 3,000 golden francs to start the construction. The expenses were very much, and once again, in 1869, the Carmelite order allocated to the parish priest other 2,000 golden francs to terminate the construction. This church, we don't know exactly whether it was within the walls or outside the walls, because already in those years the walls of the city started crumbling and falling to pieces. We know, we can say that the church was built on the border of the town.
When was the building of the church terminated?
The building of the church was terminated in 1871. The parish priest in those days was Father Albert Caruana, born in Gozo, a small island next to Malta. In 1848, he came to Mount Carmel, and as he learned the Arabic language, in 1853, he was nominated parish priest of Haifa. And he retained this office until he died in May 1880. In those years, 1880, we can say that they started a golden era for the Latin Parish Church in Haifa, because very many religious associations began to establish themselves within the limits of the Latin Parish Church. It was in 1883 when the Christian Brothers came to Haifa and took over the Latin Parish School. In 1891, the French Carmelite sisters established themselves in the old Haifa, today's Bet Galim. In 1884, the German sisters inaugurated a small clinic, a pharmacy, a nursery, and also a hostel for the pilgrims in the German colony. Again in 1999, the Sisters of Charity, they built a great establishment for the aged persons and also a school for the girls. In 1907, the Italian Carmelite sisters came to Haifa to assist the Carmelite fathers and also opened a school for the children. 3 years later, in 1910, the French Carmelite sisters, Carmel Saint-Joseph, established themselves in the old town of Haifa, today's Bet Galim, and all this golden era of the Latin Parish Church came to a sudden end with the declaration of the First World War.
Why did the Carmelites decide to leave the old church and move to Amaganim Avenue?
From the very beginning of the building of this church, the fathers had a little trouble, because being very near to the seashore, there was the seepage of the humidity. And already 20 years later, in 1891, cracks started showing in the walls of the church, and the Carmelite order allocated 3,000 golden francs to the parish priest for the restoration of the church and to strengthen the walls. And he did so in 1891 by putting also iron bars, iron bands all over from the outside, all over the church. Also, after the First World War, because of the seepage of the sea water, humidity was ruining all the plastering of the church. Plaster was falling down to pieces. And once again, in demand, they consulted a German engineer and an Arab architect by the name of Reuben of the family Awad. And they started making the repairs of the plaster and the plastering of the church in August 1924. Then, in the last months of 1947, there started in Haifa a massive exodus of Arabs from the town. And very few, in April 1948, very few people remained in Haifa. Of our Latin community dwindled from about 5,000 towards the end of 1947 to about 300 in April 1948. The few parishioners who were left in April 1948 took refuge on Mount Carmel. So also the Carmelite fathers, they abandoned this church and the residence and retired to our monastery on Mount Carmel. After the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948, the Carmelite fathers, they tried to retake and to occupy the residence and the church in Haifa, but they found it very much dilapidated and uninhabitable. That's why they rented a place in a small house in Wadi Nisnas, where they adapted the residence and the chapel to serve the Latin community. This church remained closed, and as you see, today it's all dilapidated. Still we can see some of the balconies over there. It was for the guests. We had as pilgrims in the church, and also for the fathers, sick fathers who could not come into the church, so they could assist to the services being done in the church. Over here, there was the high altar where we held the church services, and all this central part, the aisle, where the faithful gathered together to pray, mainly on Sundays for the church service. We are now facing the facade of the church. On top we have the sign of the Carmelite order representing the three mountains in Wadi Siyah, where 800 years ago we had our first monastery and fathers, the church which was later destroyed at the end of the Crusaders in the year 1291. Further down, you have those niches which were supposed to have the statues of the saints of the Carmelite order. On this side, this was the left side of the church, where there was the pharmacy, the guest house, and further back the school. While on the right side is this two-story building, which was for the residence of the fathers. In this church, in the parish church, there were always about 4 or 5 fathers for the spiritual welfare of the parishioners. We are going to see now some of the pictures we venerated in the old church, and some other items we used in the church service. Over here on the first picture, we have one representing Saint Joseph, which in the Carmelite order has a special devotion from the very beginning of its foundation, from the 15th century. And on the second picture, we have represented the baptism of Jesus by St. John the Baptist in the River Jordan. This picture was in the baptistry of the church, where we performed administered the baptisms of young children. Then in the third picture, we have again the picture of Saint Joseph and Saint Teresa of Avila, our mother, spiritual mother, who reformed the Carmel in the 15th century. This is the tabernacle we had in the old church, the church built in 1871. And when we practically demolished the interior of the church, we removed this tabernacle where we used to use during the church services, during the Mass, to hold the Blessed Sacrament. for distribution of communion to the faithful. In the old parish church, we had some congregations. Some of the faithful were congregating and reuniting, gathering themselves for special services and special devotions, like the one we had in honor of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. This is a very old picture of 1892, and they had the banner representing the Sacred Heart of Jesus, to whom they had special devotion. In the old parish church also we had a musical band, which was organized by a certain Carmelite father, Father Deogracias, a Spaniard. And it was a great innovation in Haifa, having a band with musical instruments, and this one was the banner of the musical band. Unfortunately, the other side representing the band is very badly preserved, because it was always exposed to the sun. We have also here, we have also here the bells we had in the belfry of the old church. We brought them here to preserve them as a memento of the old church. Vestments we used in the old church is a very old vestment done in Italy. Also, these are some of the demonstrants which we used also during the services. Over here we have one of the candlesticks which we used also in the old church.
What was the size of the Latin community during the time of Father Julius Albertus and today?
During the time of Father Julius, the Latin community included not only the Catholics of the Latin Rite, but also the Catholics of the Maronite Rite, because they had no priest and no church of their own. The major part of the Catholics were Arabs, but a part of this community of Arabs, there were also some foreigners. We know during the time of Father Julius, there was the whole family of the French vice-consul and also other Italians. As far as we know, during the time of Father Julius, the Latin community was in about 84 persons in all. But commencing from the year 1844, the Carmelite Fathers were holding the statistics year by year, mentioning each member of the community, both of the Latin community and Maronite community, by name, and also their nationality. As far as we know, during the time of Father Julius, the parishioners were only about 84. During the time of Father Albert, both communities, Latin and Maronite, they increased. So much so we can say that in 1886 we find that the Latin community increased to 132, while the Maronite community, they are mentioned each one by name and their age. they were 72 persons. In 20 years later, in 1880, the Latins were about 154, while the Maronites were 121. It was in 1880 that the Maronite community desisted to be under the jurisdiction of the Latin parish priest, because they brought from Lebanon a father of their own, and they built a church in honor of St. Louis, King of France, for their own church services. Under the jurisdiction of the Latin parish priest, there remained those Catholics of Coptic rite. According to the statistics of 1855, their number was 14 persons, and today, after 130 years, we still have descendants of these Coptic Catholics in the Coptic family. Also under the jurisdiction of the Carmelite, of the Latin parish priest, there were those Catholics of Chaldean rite. And according to the statistics of 1855, their number was only 4. Still today, we have very many families of the Chaldawi families. There were also some Catholics of Syrian rite. Then later on, at a later date, when the Armenians came after the First World War, they also came under the jurisdiction of the Latin parish priest, and they are still under our jurisdiction. In these days, when we have the statistics, when we make the statistics every year, our Latin community includes 1,355 Arabs, and also very few foreigners. But we have also another community which counts about 400 persons, whom we now call Catholics of Hebrew expression. These are not converts from Judaism. They are originally Catholics living in mixed marriages with a Jewish partner and their children. We have here a very old register from the very beginning of the existence of the Latin parish church in Haifa during the time of Father Julius Kalleya, in which are recorded the baptisms of all the children from the year 1832. One by one, as children are baptized, are recorded with their proper name, the names of the parents, the names of the godparents, the date of birth, and the date of baptism. Later on, as time passes by, we make the annotations whether these children were confirmed or entered into marriage, or even if they have passed away.
When did the community of fathers of Latin parish received autonomy?
Eventually the fathers living in the parish church, they never had their own autonomy, but they formed an integral part of the community of fathers on Mount Carmel. The fathers in Haifa, they were never self-subsistent, but they depended completely from the fathers on Mount Carmel. In fact, we know from a certain register, very old register, which records all the reunions and gatherings of the fathers, both of Haifa and those of Mount Carmel, to discuss problems and certain necessities for both communities. The fathers in Haifa and the Latin Church in Haifa has never been self-subsistent, but it was always subsidized by the fathers of Mount Carmel. All extraordinary expenses, constructions, purchases of land property were done by the fathers of Mount Carmel in the name of the discussed Carmelite order.
Describe rightfully the Latin community when you were parish priest.
When I came to Haifa in 1959, I found the Latin community of Haifa having a very peculiar and complex character. The major part of the Latin community were Arabs. But apart of these Arabs, there were also some other of foreign origin, like those employed in the consulates, British, French and Italian consulates. And we had also another community which later we called Catholics of Hebrew expression. They were not converts, but they were Catholics living in mixed marriages, originally from Poland, Germany, Hungary and other European countries, who settled here in Haifa. And this community was also an integral part of the Latin community in Haifa.
What is special about the Latin community?
Well, I have always noticed a very peculiar character in the Latin community of Haifa, because our Latin community is a cosmopolitan community, each one holding to its own ethnic origin without amalgamating with each other's, but all united in the same faith and belief. As I said, our community is formed from the majority Arab Catholics and also some foreigners and Catholics of Hebrew expression. Even in the years before pre-Vatican Council until 1964, we held in our parish church the church services in Latin and partly in Arabic, and also using the Polish language, because in the early years between up to 1960 we had a big number of Polish Catholics. Also after the Vatican Council, when we started holding church services in Arabic and Hebrew, we accentuated this peculiar character of the Latin community even much more by holding in the same church, services in Arabic and Hebrew, and in the big holidays, reuniting all the faithful, both Arabs and those of Hebrew expression, having the same church service using Arabic, Hebrew and the Latin language, thus making this Latin parish church in Haifa unique in the whole of Israel.
What is the relation between Latin Carmelites and the other Christians of Haifa today?
During the last 25 years, we had very good relation with the other Catholic communities in Haifa. Not only the Catholic communities, I would say, the Greek Catholics and the Maronites, but also with the Greek Orthodox and Protestants. So much so I remember when we were having reunions and gatherings, several reunions and gatherings during the year, to discuss problems in common to all our Christian communities. In these last years, if we have neglected these reunions and gatherings, but still we have very good relation, requesting the services and the help, the assistance of the other communities, and also exchange occasionally visits to each other. Front of the Latin Parish Church in Haifa, built, or rather the architect of this church was Antonio Barluzzi, a very renowned architect who built the great basilicas in the Holy Land. This was one of his last plans. It is not an old design, but rather is the design of the transition between the churches of the Renaissance and the modern churches. It has a big cross in front made of pink marble stones. And now we are going to visit the interior of the church and describe when this church was built and how we came to build this church in Hameginim Avenue. Like fathers tried to return to their residence and parish church in Haifa. They found it in ruins and uninhabitable, in a very deteriorated state, and therefore they could not live there, but rented a house in Wadi Nisnas, where they arranged a small residence and a chapel to serve the Latin community. Also in 1948, the Salesian fathers who abandoned their school and chapel which they had in Hameginim Avenue, and thus they were not going to return anymore to Haifa. The Sacred Congregation for the Orientals requested the disguised Carmelite order to purchase the land property from the Salesian fathers. So they did in June 1950. And it was on the 15th November 1959 when the Reverend Father Thomas Kilduff, representing the Superior General of the Carmelite Order in Rome, he laid down the cornerstone for the building of this church in the presence of Mr. Bergman, who was then governor of Haifa. There was present also Dr. Shaul Kolbe from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And as you see, the church has about 41 meters in length and 14 meters with 16 meters high. We have these columns which they go up like joining hands towards heaven in a continual prayer to Almighty God to bless always not only the Latin community of Haifa but the whole population of Haifa. Since 2 years' time, I gave my resignation as parish priest of Haifa, and nowadays there is a new parish priest, a young parish priest who understands better the character and the needs of the modern community of Haifa. He is only 38 years old. His name is Father Francisco Negral. He is a Spaniard. He made his studies in Rome, and also during the last 4 years he frequented the University of Haifa. He speaks several languages: Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, Italian, French, English, and also German.